1998. America, perhaps the world, on the brink of war.
We have to defend our future from these predators of the 21st century.
Since World War II, every international conflict has raised the specter of nuclear holocaust and global annihilation.
A single nuclear bomb may certainly be exploded in our lifetime, just as there may be a release of a biological agent.
More than 100,000 gallons of chemical weapons agents and a massive biological weapons facility at Al-Hakim equipped to produce anthrax and other deadly agents.
These weapons of mass destruction force us to rely on deterrence, a delicate international standoff with the frightening name of man.
If we're talking about countries, you nuke me, I'll nuke you.
Today, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the balance of power has splintered into balance of terror, leaving us all vulnerable. Vulnerable to rogue nations with aggressive leaders who won't play by our rules, and to terrorists who have nothing to risk and therefore nothing to lose.
They want to bring the collapse of their enemies, regardless of the price they may have to pay or innocents may have to pay.
Vulnerable to high-tech germ warfare and low-tech explosive assault.
These individuals pose a potential chemical and biological threat.
Terror from without and terror from within.
I think Tim McVeigh looks like the kids I went to high school with.
Tonight, we'll expose these threats and examine your vulnerability. You'll travel deep underground into formerly top-secret installations designed to protect our leaders and our resources. You'll meet those who design nuclear weapons and those who combat them. You'll explore the cutting edge of technology, global war, and terrorism. It's part war story, part mystery. Sift the clues and discover the truth. Where are you, your friends, your family in America's doomsday plan? Nestled in the rolling hills of West Virginia is the Greenbrier, an exclusive five-star resort that has catered to the whims of civilization's well-heeled and elite for over 200 years. What none of us knew is that buried 4 stories below the civilized facade of the Greenbrier is the ultimate power enclave, a secret air raid shelter for the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. For more than 3 decades, the Greenbrier bunker was a key element in the U.S. government's doomsday plan. It was the perfect 50s Hollywood spy film. 200 government agents decoyed as TV repairmen working in round-the-clock shifts to protect this delicate secret.
We were a concessionaire, if you will, to the hotel to provide television and other audio-video support to the hotel as requested by them. We spent about 15-20% of our time doing that. The other 80% of the time, we were actually maintaining and operating the fallout shelter itself. Had you been here 10 years ago in some way got up into this area, you would have seen this structure up here, you would have seen a danger high voltage sign, and you would have asked for an explanation from somebody, and they would have simply told you those were the mechanical features, housing, equipment to the hotel.
As preposterous as it seems today, a simple danger sign stood guard over this complex scheme, an untested plan to ensure that the United States of America would survive as a nation in the event of nuclear strike.
We were in a state of readiness. Within a 4 to 8 hour period of time, we could have received our clients, so to speak, and we would have been up and running. This is a 400-foot tunnel that we're going to be walking down. Essentially, we have 3 to 5 feet of concrete around us as we're walking up this tunnel. You've gotten rid of your clothing just prior to coming in here, and then as we step through here, we would have been issued fatigues or coveralls, something of a unisex type of wearing apparel.
Following decontamination, legislators would be ushered to their quarters, one of 18 Spartan dormitories, and given a locker for their personal effects. Below the ground, they would survive in a self-contained universe.
If we lost all the lighting in here right now, you have about 100 emergency lights spread throughout the facility. They would come on, then we would proceed to start these big engines back here. And then we would go from commercial power to emergency generation being fed by these Fairbanks Morris diesel generators.
The essentials, electricity, heat, pure water, and decontaminated air were supplied from the bunker's bowels with a 60-day capacity.
You have on site here at all times 75,000 gallons of fresh water, good water.
A remote-operated 75-foot antenna would provide communication with the outside world if there were anyone left to watch.
This particular room not only could be used as a conference briefing room, but it was also a telecasting studio, so that a congressman or a senator could stand in front of this mural and televise a message back to his district or back to his state, stating whatever it is that he felt would be appropriate.
Rice and chicken, cream cottage cheese, one of my favorites, vegetable stew, chicken a la king.
Beef sausage patties, etc., etc.
High school food.
There you go. And is what it is. It's basically your foodstuffs that have a long shelf life, and all you need is water to reconstitute them. And of course, then you need a little seasoning and what have you, and then you need some of the Greenbrier chefs to add their little touch to it. And it's quite palatable, to say the least.
The Congress probably would have come thinking they're going to get Greenbrier food, and Greenbrier service, and Greenbrier rooms, and they find themselves in those dorms, and
Yeah, they would know they was in the Cold War, wouldn't they, or whatever.
The irony of a bare-bones bunker serving up K-rations to the leaders of the formerly free world below a five-star resort is laughable today, but in 1959 it made a weird kind of sense.
The Greenbrier on top and the facility underneath the bunker really is a kind of externalization of the American psyche through that period, the unspeakable fear that we suppressed below ground.
President Eisenhower initiated construction of the Greenbrier bunker in 1956. It was the best of times. A-bomb-armed America was rich and powerful and felt as if it ruled the world, and the worst of times. Much like today, everyone and everything was subject to scrutiny and investigation.
The generation that conceived of these things came out of the Second World War, out of places like Corregidor and in the Philippines, where they had tunnels and they had supplies pre-positioned, and they hid in there when Japanese bombers came overhead. And they remembered Pearl Harbor and the single lesson of being prepared and what happens when you're not prepared.
Eisenhower knew that in a doomsday scenario, it was essential for government to continue at all cost.
The magic words are continuity of government, COG, and there are COG plans always there to be used.
While the Greenbrier was designed as the relocation facility for Congress, Mount Weather was to be the destination for the President, the Supreme Court, and the Cabinet. In the event of a nuclear attack, they would be brought to this underground bunker. But for all this to work, it needed to be top secret. Amazingly, other than key Senate leaders, Congress itself was kept in the dark.
so the rest of the Congress and the Senate weren't in on the secret.
That's correct.
So how was it anticipated they would find out and get moved?
Suffice it to say there was a system.
The doomsday bureaucracy that created the Greenbrier facility and kept it secret for over 30 years took on a life of its own. But in the end, the ultimate enemy of the Greenbrier was the philosophy of the bunker itself.
This plan would not have worked ever. Imagine the scenario. The United States and the Soviet Union are going eyeball to eyeball. What would happen if the United States Congress withdrew from the United States Capitol in the time of this crisis, just disappeared? The press would know instantly, so would the Soviets. And that in and of itself could trigger a nuclear attack. A nuclear war, or the threat of it, might well not have conveniently occurred at the time when everyone was in session and gathered neatly in a vote. The fact is they would have been dispersed all over, raising funds, some in their home districts, etc. It would have been like trying to herd chickens, trying to get all of those people at a time of great crisis out to the bunker would have been a great logistical feat.
Sealed behind the 30-ton blast doors, Congress would wait, not knowing what, if anything, awaited them after a full-scale attack by thousands of Soviet missiles.
There was no provision made for spouses or children. Leaders of Congress, past and present, said they could not imagine leaving their spouses and children to be incinerated at Ground Zero.
You have family and friends, and they all couldn't get in here, you know that, so well, I was struggling with it, you know. I often thought about if we was in here, and then we went back out, I mean, what would be there for us?
The better question is, what about the rest of us? Suffice it to say, there were no bunkers for us, no doomsday plan. One way or another, we would all die. In military terms, we had become acceptable losses.
I was in the kitchen when it happened. The phone rang and I went to pick it up when suddenly the blender began spontaneously turning. I thought that was odd. Then the cupboard door opened by itself, showing all the dishes inside. And then the power in the overhead light surged. The game show playing on the TV suddenly stopped. Then for maybe a second or two, there was a news anchorman with a map of Iceland on the screen behind him. Hello? And then the flash hit. My plastic coffee cup melted sideways on the counter, and the plastic frame of the TV began dissolving. I looked at my hand and saw that the telephone was turning to mud in my palm. I saw a bit of skin rip away. And then the pulse occurred. The kitchen window blew inward, all bright and sparkling like tinsel on a Christmas tree. The blender crashed into the wall and the Post-it notes on the fridge ignited. And then I was dead.
A megaton-class nuclear weapon has a fireball that has a radius of about a mile. Within that mile, everything is basically vaporized. Outside that, to maybe 5 miles or so, you'll have very severe blast overpressure. Buildings will be knocked down by the blast waves that come out of here, and the level of beta burns and other things will basically be lethal. The nature of the horror of nuclear war is well beyond the popular perception. The popular perception is it's somehow clean. It's not. You die of radiation poisoning because the ionizing radiation has basically blasted every cell in your body at the same time. This means that all of your cells are trying to die at once, and you die by vomiting and diarrhea until you dehydrate.
With a plan in place to shield the government, the doomsday strategists knew the next element, keeping watch over our enemies, was essential. Their answer was NORAD, a 4.5-acre military city carved deep into a Colorado mountain. The most fortified underground installation in the history of the world, Cheyenne Mountain consists of 15 interconnected buildings suspended on hundreds of steel springs designed to withstand the shock of nuclear detonation.
It's a group of tunnels connected in a grid pattern with rock in between to provide extra strength.
An ultra-high-tech monitoring facility that would maintain constant vigil to know if and when enemy missiles were launched against us.
One of the key ingredients that I believe brought an end to the Cold War was the notion that everybody knows that NORAD knows. The overhead sensors would see the heat plume of the rocket as it's leaving its installation. And when that motor burns out, then you have a ballistic trajectory.
In the unlikely event, of course, that we ever thought that we were under attack, our job is then to characterize what's happening and to give advice on what would be an appropriate course of action. And we'll do it in less than 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And that is a very sacred time. Quick alert! Stand by for
For the exercise, give me a strategic discipline talking, please.
Quick alert, 0001 X-ray. DSD is reporting in Eastern. Quick alert, Russia.
2:30. 3 minutes.
The assessment for this missile is no. North America is not under attack.
In a world dominated by two superpowers, NORAD, like Greenbrier, was critical to the plan. It stood watch over a deadly international game of atomic chicken known as MAD, or mutually assured destruction.
We have made a Faustian bargain. We have created weapons that are so terrible that they actually deter war.
The MAD doctrine, despite its acronym, probably was the sanest doctrine we could have come up with under the circumstances. Peace is the sturdy twin of terror. That's the nuclear age. You maintain stability, nuclear peace, by threatening devastating retaliation if anybody attacks you.
There's been a sequence of chairmen of the Soviet Union, now of Russia. There's been a sequence of presidents of the United States. We've had all of these near conflicts going on, but we've never had a nuclear war.
MAD was calculated madness. That what we were talking about is basically the end of life on the planet as we know it. And that was so terrifying. It was such madness that in fact it prevented nuclear war for a half a century.
The strategy of mutually assured destruction has held as a good strategy all these many years. The drawdown of the nuclear forces of both countries sees that still as a viable defensive mechanism, but this national missile defense system is not intended to defend against the full weight of an attack.
What is the defense we have against a launch against the United States?
Zero. We have no defense of the United States. There is no ballistic missile defense covering the United States. If a long-range ballistic missile from China or Russia is launched against the United States, it's going to land here.
If the missiles were launched, what kind of protection do we have in place?
We have no meaningful protection at all, either active defense or passive defense.
Our publics need to know is there is no defense system deployed in the United States of America or Canada at present time that can deal with an incoming ballistic missile.
Ballistic missile defense, you've got an adversary, somebody on the other side that knows physics and engineering potentially just as well as you do. It's a competitive interaction. It's a strategic interaction. They can do things to try to mess up your defense. And that's where all the difficulties in ballistic missile defense come. When you saw the CNN footage, there were a lot of intercepts that looked successful. But more importantly, President Bush came on and stated that the Patriot was over 90% effective. Today, I think the Army claims that the Patriot was between 40 to 70% effective. Other studies show that the Patriot effectiveness may have been closer to zero. This is firing a bullet at a bullet and knocking the bullet out of the sky.
With no defense against incoming missiles, we had no choice but to rely on MAD to protect us. But times have changed. The breakup of the Soviet Union and the resulting détente have led to a new strategy, one of arms control and arms reduction.
There is not a single nuclear missile pointed at a child in the United States of America.
Be that as it may, the threat has shifted. Anonymous terrorists have begun to acquire Russia's nuclear materials.
Power basically has devolved from the superpowers, who had the capacity to wreak mass casualties, havoc, carnage on an unprecedented scale, using weapons of mass destruction, nuclear bombs, chemical weapons, biological agents.
But it's very hard to deter someone if you don't know who they are, if you don't know where to find them.
If we're talking about countries, you nuke me, I'll nuke you. Suppose you don't know who you is.
The scientists would concede that a small group would have a chance of constructing a low-yield, quite crude nuclear device.
A wild card, a single nuclear bomb may certainly be exploded in our lifetime.
The ability to do this, the proliferation of knowledge and the will to use that knowledge, makes terrorism a whole new ballgame.
I was in rush hour traffic leaving the city when it happened. I had the radio on scanning the FM stations, and suddenly it wouldn't pick up any signals. I kept fiddling with the buttons with my head down by the dashboard. Just then, many of the cars around me began honking, and on the radio, a woman's voice began discussing strategic events, and the flash hit. Quickly, flaring silently in a second. When my eyes readjusted, the roof of the convertible 2 cars ahead of me was on fire. Noise? A roar, I guess. It happened so fast. 2 motorcyclists, floating like helium balloons. 1 car, I remember, with a dead young woman in the driver's seat, her neck obviously broken and flailing with a set of pearls, her hair gone, her briefcase falling through the window. And I remember it was hard to breathe, like being in a sauna. And I remember a tractor-trailer rig smashing into my car, and then I was dead.
January 25th, 1995, 8 minutes to doomsday. Russian tactical missiles forward deployed, target the United States. On January 25th, 1995, there was an event, a frightening event in the Soviet Union. We'll talk about that, please.
The basic events were the launch from an island off the coast of Norway, Andoya Island, of a sounding rocket, a scientific research rocket, that was perceived by Russian command and control as a combat rocket.
Believing they were tracking the leading edge of a U.S. nuclear attack, Russian command and control had just 10 minutes to study their own doomsday blueprint.
And for a period of about 8 minutes, the Russians were unable to distinguish between what they thought was a combat rocket and what in fact was a harmless scientific activity.
So they saw this on their scopes and they thought that the attack had begun.
That's right. And in fact, the more insecure Russia is, the more it perceives itself to be vulnerable to an American first strike, the greater the reliance upon a hair trigger, which I think is a great danger.
You must have seen that event in this room,
Right.
as they saw it in their version of this room. That must have been of some concern to the people in this room.
Well, it wasn't concern to us because it wasn't a threat to us.
Our drill here is to determine whether it's a threat to North America or not.
But if the Russians think that a missile is coming at them...
To us, it didn't look like a threat to Russia either.
Oh, it didn't look like a threat to Russia in this room. It only looked like a threat to Russia in Russia.
There's procedures I'm sure that they also have that try and verify and validate.
For the first time in history, the Russians activated President Yeltsin's nuclear briefcase. In 8 minutes, they had executed every step towards a nuclear launch against the United States, except the last. At the height of the Cold War, there were 45,000 Soviet missiles targeting the U.S. Today, there are fewer than 6,000. But to doomsday strategists, the 39,000 that have been disengaged present an even more frightening threat. For now, there is not just one finger on the trigger, there are many.
You have a tremendous stock of weapons-grade material scattered at dozens and dozens of sites. You're talking about hundreds of tons of plutonium and highly enriched uranium. The most acute nuclear threat emanating from the former Soviet Union today, I would say it has nothing to do with weapons at all. It has to do with the underdeveloped state of nuclear safety. It's a very, very real problem. Even though you may find physical protection present in the form of equipment and technology, the individuals who have responsibility for working at these sites don't really know that they can't take shortcuts.
Russia's crumbling economy has brought the country to its knees. Even their vast military, once the pride of the communists, has been crippled. Often months go by when soldiers and scientists are not paid. This includes personnel at nuclear facilities.
There's a general problem of chaos, I would say, in Russia.
Even though none of these individuals may be disloyal citizens, if they're hungry, if they can't support their families, if they no longer have jobs that pay anything, if they are experiencing political and social turmoil.
Often they're insiders working at a plant and they think, oh, I've heard that people make money of this kind of material, and they are able to get their hands on a small quantity of material, and so they try to sell it.
In 1992, U.S. agents surreptitiously purchased 500 tons of bomb-grade uranium on the Russian black market. But there is still enough fissile material scattered throughout the former republics for 50,000 Hiroshimas.
We know that there have been very sensitive defense goods that have been put on the marketplace, accessible to a would-be proliferator. If you were interested in acquiring nuclear material, that would lead you to some of the non-Russian successor states.
In 1997, General Alexander Lebed, Yeltsin's Secretary of National Security, admitted that 84 of Russia's smallest nuclear weapons, easily transportable suitcase bombs, could not be accounted for.
They're only about this big. I hate the idea of some idiot threatening mankind with a nuclear device, any time, any place.
The clock is ticking. There are people out there who are incredibly malevolent. Some of them don't belong to political groups, some of them don't belong to any specific country. In other cases, they operate independently of even state support.
Some of these terrorists may have targeted Rocky Flats, a former nuclear weapons plant in New Mexico. Dubbed the most dangerous place in America, for years it produced the explosive parts of every nuclear bomb in our arsenal.
Rocky Flats was used to manufacture components of nuclear weapons, and it now contains approximately 21 tons of special nuclear material.
21 tons? How many bombs can you make with 21 tons of plutonium?
I'm not an expert in that area, but suffice it to say that you could become a world power easily with 21 tons of plutonium.
From your point of view, how vulnerable was the facility when you left?
It's not just my point of view. Both I and highly placed DOE officials felt that the facility was at high risk.
What does high risk mean? That someone could walk in and steal the fissile materials?
Yes. Or that someone could get onto the site and do something with plutonium or highly enriched uranium while on the site. They look at the nuclear material there as an environmental contaminant to be disposed of, rather than the one component necessary to build a nuclear weapon.
Even Department of Energy officials don't deny the dangers at Rocky Flats.
It's a tough security problem. We're looking at it. Some of the points made, I thought, were valid, and they're being addressed. Other points we're looking at.
The dark irony of Rocky Flats is that while America is spending hundreds of millions to buy loose Russian nuclear material on the black market to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands, the very same materials are up for grabs here at home.
They don't understand that you can't let this thing get away even once.
I was at the office when it happened. The flash came from the main bank of windows across the office near the lunchroom. We saw Brent and Tracy headed our way, glowing red because the light rays and the gamma rays had passed through their bodies, lighting them up from the inside like aborted embryos. Ellen and I were just starting to go over to them when the blast hit like a bursting dam, crashing through the windows and shooting Brent and Tracy straight out the window onto the employee parking lot. I remember Ellen grabbing for me as she was being helplessly sucked out of the building. Blood leaking from her ears, her hair pulled back, a bottle of whiteout exploding against her skull, and then dying together somewhere up in the sky.
Imagine 90,000 people at the World Series, drinking beer, eating hot dogs, and rooting for their team. What they don't know is the unthinkable. A small team of terrorists have taken control, threatening to kill everyone in the stadium unless their demands are met. Anti-terrorist experts ask 4 questions. Do they have the motive? Do they have the means? Do they have the weapons? Will they really stop at nothing? the World Trade Center explosion was caused by a homemade fertilizer bomb. Had the terrorists laced their bomb with nuclear materials obtained on the black market or from a vulnerable site like Rocky Flats, they would have succeeded at their goal.
The idea really was to topple one of the center towers into the other. And a rough estimate is that there would have been 50,000 casualties. And it certainly served as a wake-up call for the government and for the nation.
That group of conspirators that blew up the World Trade Center, had they possessed a nuclear device, certainly would have used it. So the important part there is they had the mindset. They were quite willing to engage in massive destruction, in mass murder.
Timothy McVeigh used a similar device in Oklahoma City to tragic consequence. The first news reports assumed it to be a foreign terrorist attack. What took us all by surprise was that this time the terrorists were homegrown.
I think Tim McVeigh looks like kids I went to high school with. They look like us. They have mothers, fathers, sisters. Many of them have the same concerns that we do, paying mortgages, paying bills. But they're different.
If those individuals responsible for the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City had a nuclear device, Oklahoma City basically would have been devastated.
And the suburbs and the outlying suburbs would be by and large either vaporized or utterly destroyed by the shockwave.
These frightening events are in themselves creating the new blueprint.
Terrorists feel fully justified in the use of violence.
We face a very, very real threat of chemical or biological terrorism.
The world has never witnessed a terrorist attack with a biological agent.
The stuff of novels today may be the stuff of headlines tomorrow.
Anthrax is more than just the stuff of headlines. Released into the air and inhaled by the population of a city, a vial of anthrax would cause tens or even hundreds of thousands of deaths within a week.
You could get a small amount of biological agent into this country in so many different ways, and then a terrorist could release the stuff in a major city, and it would be absolutely devastating.
Within about 2 or 3 days, people would develop a cold.
Initially cough and difficulty breathing and exhaustion.
And then within several days after that, people would begin to die. And they would die in great numbers.
It can be upwards of hundreds of thousands of people killed with anthrax.
Anthrax is a terrible weapon.
And the problem with anthrax is that once you have bad flu symptoms, it's too late. There is no remedial medical intervention that can stop it.
With a variety of weapons of mass destruction available from numerous sources, it's just a matter of time before a terrorist makes use of them.
You watch the deranged individuals, and in many cases the criminal extortionists, because they are the ones that tend to be the innovators. They are the avant-garde, if you will. The use of sarin, nerve gas in Tokyo, has had a kind of inspirational effect because we know that a lot more people now, extremist groups, at least are thinking about it.
With these new and unpredictable threats, how can a doomsday plan protect us against those who cannot be deterred?
As we move into the 90s and we move into conflicts that are driven by ethnic hatreds, there the objective simply is to kill as many people as possible. Ethnic conflicts lend themselves to genocidal strategies.
They want to bring the collapse of their enemies, regardless of the price they may have to pay or innocents may have to pay. Because in their view, there are no innocents.
When we move off the planet altogether and talk about those who believe they are motivated by God, whether that God speaks to them through the mouth of some mad sheikh, or whether it speaks to them through the mouth of some guru in Tokyo, that removes all constraints imposed by conventional morality.
A group that is acting on behalf of a deity or some god thinks that the Messiah will return, thinks that they're fighting good and evil in some kind of Armageddon scenario. That is a very scary prospect.
Once we had one or two enemies. Now we have scores of fanatical groups, many of whom have access to chemical or biological materials.
There's sort of a myth that the right bright guy could go down to a Radio Shack and get the parts to make an atom bomb. Is that true?
That is not true. No, that's a gross exaggeration.
How easy is it for someone to construct a nuclear weapon at this point in time?
Very easy, and it's been easy for a long time.
It's just a myth. That's correct. Though it may not be a myth that a high school student could develop biological agents.
I mean, I may be able to find the plans for a diesel engine in the encyclopedia. That doesn't mean I can make a diesel engine.
To make something which would explode with the equivalent of at least 1,000 tons of high explosive is easy.
I was having my hair done when it happened. It was like a dream. It was the last thing anyone expected. Everyone wrapped up in their own little world. I thought it was lightning at first, but it had been a sunny day. I was frozen and could only watch. And then the explosion. Now, everything's different.
Experts suggest that terrorists' first targets might be Manhattan, financial capital of the world and headquarters of the UN, or San Francisco, mostly for its compact size and symbolic value. Surprisingly, Washington would be last. They'd need someone to negotiate. To better understand the plan for a terrorist assault, we sought out those on the front lines, the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, or NEST.
What's set up here is what you could call a data collection van. This could serve as a long-term mobile command post, and essentially it's set up for us for the aftermath of a release. And there's
a release, you mean an explosion?
I mean a release. It could be an explosion or a dispersal that's been caused by some type of other release.
In the event of a release or the threat of one, these nuclear ninjas go in to seek out the source.
How tough is it to find the kinds of objects that this searches for? Is it like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack, or do you have much more control than that?
If we have a city block to look through, that's better than having a city to look through. The scenario may be such that we don't have a clue of where to search for. That's going to be that's the needle in the haystack.
And I'm glad they're there. I certainly strongly support NEST, the whole idea. Go for it. But I'm not optimistic about finding it if the enemy know what they're doing. Build it in the basement, literally.
Shielding is not complicated.
No, shielding is just mass. 15 feet of water will do it. 6 or 8 feet of ground will shield absolutely so the nest can never see it.
We exercise a lot and train a lot on how to go out and do these things. We like to think that we would be able to be successful at doing. This is something that we've never gone up against before. We don't think time's on our side. There's a real potential out there, and we're doing what we can to deal with it, to be ready to deal with it.
Whether a chemical release or a nuclear explosion, a terrorist event leaves us all vulnerable. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is charged with establishing quick and effective communications, the first step towards survival.
So this is the critical heart of the communication system after a disaster scenario, after a terrorist attack. This is what you send in.
Sure is. This provides the heart of all of our communications. If you just look at it as a giant cell phone, we can be up and running with telephone lines about 30 to 40 minutes after the time we park it.
We
have an infrastructure in place here from a communication system that would allow us to communicate to the outside world. We work in concert with 26 other federal agencies and the American Red Cross to try to manage the consequences of, we've had the World Trade Center, we've had Oklahoma City, we've had what happened in Japan. There's been a lot of talk about what's happened to these nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union was dissolved. How many are missing? Who knows? You need to be as prepared and as trained as you can possibly be to deal with those kinds of scenarios from happening. And I think that we're in the process of doing that.
You have to perhaps develop protective measures for civilians, civil defenses, gas masks or things like that people can wear. You have to develop the medical response teams so that you can airlift in massive doses of antibiotics and vaccinate populations.
It brings up impressions of the 50s. Paranoia and fear
the civil defense.
And civil defense
exactly.
exists today.
That's right, exactly. It's a different type of civil defense. It's actually very much like what the Israelis do. The Israeli population does have gas masks. They have gas masks that fit children. There are scores of people that would still die. But at least, their population is now used to the thought that they have gas masks, and one for each of their children.
But are Americans really prepared for gas masks in their homes or mass inoculation? We've recently announced that we're going to protect the armed forces against anthrax, but not the civilian population. Though, if you think about it, the civilian population is a lot more vulnerable. It's easier to get to them with anthrax than it is to get to the armed forces with anthrax. They're protected, we're not. Is the next step inoculating everybody?
No, I would not recommend inoculating everybody. On the other hand, I would recommend stockpiling vaccines and pharmaceuticals so that they are available in the event that an anthrax release is detected. Right now, unfortunately, if a terrorist were to try to employ one of these weapons, we don't have the pharmaceuticals stockpiled at area hospitals.
Ironically, it appears the blueprint is being created a layer at a time as each new threat is revealed. Like NORAD, all we can do is watch and wait.
At this point, really, the argument becomes almost theological. There are the disbelievers who say, it hasn't happened, it will not happen. I suppose on the other side, there are those we might label the apocalypticians, who subscribe to a kind of Murphy's Law of human behavior. If something bad can be done, ultimately, someone bad will do it.
In the end, this is a story of power and a story of fear. What began with a white-hot flash and brought about a doomsday struggle between two superpowers has morphed into an almost mythological battle, waged on a global field. Today, the scale is enormous, the stakes even greater. And so, when the military looks ahead in search of a new doomsday plan, they look not to our world, but far above. To the prospect of Star Wars, super weapons floating in space. What they seek, ironically, is a return to the raw certainty of MAD, when peace was truly terror's sturdy twin. Their hope is that the higher ground of outer space will give the advantage they need, the advantage that the A-bomb's first blast seemed to promise. Until that time, there is no assured defense, only the shaky promise of constant watchfulness against the unthinkable and the unknown.